think that it's about time we get this conscious party started for real. Hey, yo, everyone, gather around. It's story time. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, and a Conscious Party Productions. You are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast.
A conscious party.
Revolutionizing our minds.
Elevating our consciousness.
Changing our worlds.
Your story.
My story.
Our story.
All right. Well, welcome to another live recording of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Christian Ace Stettler, and I believe we're on episode 48, so we're moving right along. And I'm very honored to have Mr. Alan Dettlaff here. Did I say that right?
Yep.
How are you, Alan?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me to be here today. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have you. Where are you joining us from?
I'm in Houston, Texas.
Houston, Texas. So, well, Texas often gets represented as the biggest state, but I always see them put the Texas on the state of Alaska, and I have to say we're your bigger brother in some ways.
Yeah, no, I knew that. Yeah, Alaska's the biggest one for sure.
Yeah. But no, I'm glad to have you, Alan. And we were just talking before we went live, just about how this abolitionist social work movement has kind of flown under my radar. I actually had the honor and the privilege of taking a class when I was at University of Hawaii with Angela Davis. She was our guest professor for the semester. So she kind of got me introduced into abolition in general. Mm-hmm. But I think most people haven't thought about it in the terms of social work. Mm-hmm. I think most people don't know, they think of abolition as slavery in the 1800s. But even those that know about abolition, I don't think abolition social work is quite on the radar yet. Mm-hmm. So tell us about it. You have a movement called the UpEND Movement. Tell us about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the UpEND Movement is an abolitionist organization or movement that focuses primarily on abolition of the child welfare system, or those of us who do this work, many of us refer to it as the family policing system, because we believe that better captures the roles and functions of what the child welfare system does in people's lives. And that use of that term, family policing system, is really an intentional rejection of that term, child welfare system, which is the name that the state has given us to think about that system. But when you think about what that system does, the system largely separates children from their parents because of issues related to poverty. And because of mandatory reporting laws, is very active in surveilling and monitoring families. So we think of that as being more functions of surveillance, regulation of behavior, punishment of behavior, up to and including removal of people's children. So the UpEND movement works as a movement to abolish that system. But, I really think of the abolition movement as much bigger than that. Going back to the era of slavery. One of the things about the abolition movement that I think is important, or the way that I think about the abolition movement, is that the movement of abolition today is really the same as the abolition movement that began during slavery. When you look back at the era of chattel slavery and the abolition movement of that time, what I've learned over the years in studying that movement is that the real goals of that movement were never solely abolition of slavery. Abolition of slavery was necessary to achieve the true goals of the abolition movement, but the real goal of the abolition movement was liberation and equality of people who were formerly enslaved. And although abolition of slavery was achieved in some respects through the 13th Amendment, that liberation, equality aspect of what the abolition movement was founded on has never been achieved in the United States. And one of the many of the institutions that arose post-slavery, prisons, policing, and the child welfare system, are the systems that today maintain inequality. So the abolition movement today is still looking at ending systems that are maintaining oppression and contributing to inequality of Black Americans and other people of color. I lost your sound.
Somehow I got clicked off. Yeah. Sorry about that. So let's try to situate abolition a little bit more. So we have abolition of slavery, which, successful in some degree, but not completely successful. But then let's move into like the civil rights era, and let's look at like Angela Davis, prison abolition. So when I look at that, at the abolition of the prison industrial complex, Angela Davis and other abolitionists obviously have done a great job there's a whole gang of people around the world that are now, imagining a new world without some of these institutions like the prison industrial complex. But if you look at it from the stance of less incarceration, it hasn't been successful in that regard. And so where are we at now? Does that make sense? Where do we sit at now when we're talking about abolition of social work? What is the goal?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to caution and say that I'm not positive that social work can be abolitionist in terms of the way that social work over time has been constructed as a profession. And we can talk more about what that means. I think there is an abolition movement in the United States and around the world that many social workers are a part of and learning to be part of. And that also brings then questioning what are our profession's space in that work and how our profession contributes to the oppression and the inequality that the abolition movement is trying to address. But I think when you look at that broader abolition movement that did start in many ways in the 1960s with the Attica prison uprising, I think that for many years that abolition movement was viewed as a largely fringe movement that wasn't that many social workers in particularly weren't aware of and weren't part of. And Angela Davis is one of the people who really had been working for decades to change that. Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, other people through Critical Resistance. But I really do think that we saw a fundamental shift in the way that we think about the abolition movement with 2020, the murder of George Floyd by the police, the murder of many other people by the police, and the rise of the defund the police movement, which brought abolitionist ideas to more of a national attention. So I think the movement today has advanced in the last 4 years much more rapidly than it has in the decades before that. So I think that's encouraging.
Yeah, what did you mean when you said that you think that social workers might not be able to be abolitionists?
It's not that social workers can't be abolitionist. I'm not sure that the profession can be abolitionist. When you really think about the history of the profession, many people think about the profession going back to Jane Addams and thinking about the settlement houses and the settlement movement and what was really kind of more broadly termed a child-saving movement of that time, of being a helpful, benevolent movement that was trying to integrate European immigrant children into American society. But when you really look at the origins of that movement, a lot of those early days of social work were really about social control. They were about addressing poor children in society who had become a nuisance to the white elites in society, and responding to those behaviors by trying to control those behaviors and make those poor children more into what this new country of America wanted to be. So a lot of the origins of social work were really about controlling the behaviors of the poor, limiting poor people to certain geographic spaces, but also trying to provide them with things like moral instruction, training in job skills, things like that, as a citizen building kind of project. So the origins of social work are really about social control, behavioral control. And I don't know that the profession has really progressed a lot since then. Social work as a profession is dependent on working with people who exist in poverty. And I don't know that we're really doing a lot of things in a broader sense to address the conditions that contribute to poverty. When you think about a lot of the spaces where social workers work in, and many of those places are carceral spaces like with the police, in the child welfare system, forcibly separating children from their families, a lot of social work is about pathologizing individual behaviors and trying to address individual issues that contribute to poverty rather than focusing on the broader issues in society that contribute to people's poverty. So when you look at it from that sense, and then when you look at social work's rejection over the last several years about this abolitionist movement, even in response to all that we've seen about the violence and racism inherent in policing, the violence and racism inherent in family separations, we've seen social work as a profession, our professional organizations like the National Association of Social Workers, just double down on our collaborations with these carceral institutions. So I'm not sure that the profession as a whole has any interest in moving in an abolitionist space.
Do you think that the profession can be moved in that direction?
That's what I and many others have hoped for in the profession. But I don't know. I think that social work for many years has struggled with what I think of as an inferiority complex, in the sense that we have felt a need to compare ourselves to other professions like psychology, psychiatry, other professions that have been around longer than ours and have been professionalized for longer than ours. And our professional, this movement to professionalize ourselves, to license ourselves, to demonstrate to the public that we're worthy as a profession, that's led to a lack of willingness to critique ourselves as a profession and look at some of the racist origins of the profession, look at some of the carceral mentality that the profession was founded on. I remember in summer of 2020, shortly after the then president of the National Association of Social Workers wrote an op-ed praising social work's collaboration with policing. And if you remember at that time, there was kind of this movement to rush social work into policing, saying that social work can be the solution to some of the racism and harm that we were seeing in policing. The president of NASW at that time, Angela McLean, wrote an op-ed praising all of the collaboration that social work is doing with the police, basically saying we're already doing that. We're already working with police. We're ready and able to do more. That's our role. Many of us pushed back from that. I wrote an op-ed, a local op-ed in the Houston Chronicle, just challenging whether social work was the solution to the racism in policing. And I got a phone call from the then president of the Council on Social Work Education, who was upset that I wrote this op-ed and basically said that, yes, social work needs to have those conversations, but those conversations need to happen behind closed doors. So there's this attitude that we can't challenge ourselves in a public sense. And if we continue to have that attitude that we can't look at ourselves critically, we're never going to get to the place where we can really embrace abolitionism as a way of the future of social work.
Yeah, and I think, we were talking about earlier, I've been following the NASW on social media just recently in the last couple months. And the thing that bothers me is that it feels like they are just repeating the Democratic Party's talking points. And the reason I think that's so much of a problem is that everything is compared to Donald Trump, but that's a really low bar to set. And so like you were mentioning, we're not looking at social workers as individuals, I shouldn't say as all individuals, but many of social work individuals. And collectively, we're not able to look at ourselves critically. And we're just comparing ourselves to a very, very, very low bar and saying, hey, look, we're better than that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, are you going to say something?
No, you can finish your question and then I'll...
No, I just think that, we're in this place where social work, in my opinion, where it's becoming over-professionalized, among other things, it's in the decline in some ways, not always, but in some ways. And how can we ever reverse that or change our course or imagine something different if we're unable to look at ourselves in a critical manner or look at the profession of social work critically?
I really think it's going to take more of a groundswell of social workers who are unhappy with the status quo of the profession, unhappy with these professional organizations positioning themselves as the people who get to decide what the future of the profession is. I mean, we've talked about NASW. NASW as a professional organization doesn't really represent social workers. There are about 700,000 social workers in the United States. Only about 10% of those social workers are members of NASW. So NASW at large doesn't really represent all of us as social workers. So I think it's going to take those of us who want something better from social work, those of us who look at the code of ethics of the National Association of Social Workers, particularly the part of the code of ethics that says that social workers must take action against oppression, discrimination, racism, and inequity, and realize that right now, the way that social work is practiced, that's largely just a performative, I mean, at best you could call it aspirational, but at worst you could call it performative statement, because that's not what real social work is doing. But if we recognize that we as individual social workers have more collective power together as people who want to see a more radical future for the profession, that we have more power than the NASW has, we can force NASW to change.
It's a lot to think about, Alan.
It's a challenging time for the profession now. I really think it is. I really do think that the events of 2020, the highlighting of police violence, which is important to say is something that has been known to communities of color for decades, but now was on TV daily for everyone to see. The horrific violence that's associated with policing, the conversations that very rapidly started at that same time about the harms of family separations as a result of child welfare system intervention, and social work's collaboration, not just long-standing collaborations with those systems, but really doubling down in 2020 and since then in terms of social work being able to collaborate. That's led many of us in the profession to really feel that this profession just doesn't represent us, doesn't represent what we believe social work can be. So I really think social work is at this crossroads now where we have those of us who want to see a more radical future, and then we have the NASW and the social workers who are involved in the NASW who are actively trying to prevent that more radical future from happening.
How do you view higher education's role in this? I teach social workers, and I do my best, to point people, I shouldn't say point people in the direction, but to provide a diverse array of resources and whatnot. But how can we as educators, how can we contribute to the movement or, do things to broaden students' horizons? What do you think about the role of higher education?
Yeah, I think I love that question because that's, to me, where the hope for the future of the profession is, with some caveats to that. But I think that it really is the educational process that establishes what social work is for many people who go into the profession. And I think that's the place where these critical conversations need to begin. As a curriculum, I think that social work needs to start having much more critical conversations, honest conversations about the racist origins of the profession, how much of social work contributes to racism and oppression that we see in society, but the ability for social work to change that, the ability for social work to be something that aspires to be what those codes of ethics say we can be in terms of a profession that really does challenge injustice, oppression, discrimination, racism. I think that social work education is the space where we need to be having really critical conversations about the child welfare system and our longstanding role in that system and the harm that that system causes, and what I think is the need for social work to divest ourselves from that system and work from the outside towards its abolition. Similar with policing. I think that social work has had long-standing collaborations with policing that we don't critique enough in the classroom, and I think that's the space where those conversations can advance in the classroom. Also thinking about that idea of the extent to which social workers can create change from the inside, which is something that is a narrative in social work that I think has kept us in those spaces for a long time, in policing, in prisons, in the juvenile punishment system, in child welfare. If we can look at our history and start to realize that we have stayed in these systems of harm for many years because we've told ourselves that we can create change from the inside, I think we're at a place now where we can look back on the decades that we've tried to do that and realize that despite what has been a good effort, that change that we wanted to create in that system, in those systems, has not happened. And we could say we tried, but it just wasn't successful, and that's okay. The racism that's inherent in these systems, the oppression that's inherent in these systems is too strong. And because the systems were created for those purposes, and as a result, social work just needs to remove ourselves from those systems and work from the outside toward their abolition. That's where I think social work educational spaces need to move into. I mean, the caveat to all of that is that I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that social work education really is having those conversations, but I've seen it advance in recent years. The extent to which I and others who are involved in the abolitionist movement are invited to talk to social work classes and speak on social work campuses, I mean, that's where the hope for me comes in, that social work education is the place that I hope is going to be the place that starts to bring about some of this change.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I appreciate that you mentioned up the importance of having dialogue, critical dialogue, and I see a couple of things that concern me about the social work education. One would be on the side of, let's say, well, let me back up a little bit. When I did my undergrad, which was here in Alaska, and then I left and came back, I had this honor and a privilege of participating in a couple of rural cohort programs where they would fly Alaska Natives in all from around the state, and somehow I got to be a part of those things. I'm still not sure exactly how I ended up there. But we used dialogic talking circles. And so I had this incredibly unique opportunity to participate with indigenous folks from Alaska and elders within the classroom. And I had a chance to kind of awaken, through participating in those dialogues. But then I went to the University of Hawaii at Manoa for my master's degree, for my MSW. And there were plenty of good points about my education. But I was very disappointed. There was very little room for dialogue in these classes. It was like they were training us to either be a therapist or a caseworker type of thing, funneling it, over-professionalizing us. And we really didn't have those opportunities for dialogue. But we did outside of class, the students would meet and talk about things. But it makes me think of the bigger picture of an MSW. Many students are going in through advanced standing program, which means they have 5 graduate classes, which you're supposed to be spending 6, 7, 8 hours a week per class, outside of class. You have an unpaid internship of however many hours you have to go per week, 15, 20 hours a week. Not to mention you have another life. You got to pay your bills. Might have family. You might even have another job. And so when I listen to the indigenous elders, even if you look at Paulo Freire, the father of critical pedagogy, they would tell you that the goal is to become more fully human. And I think that I was able to do that in those dialogic talking circles. I had the opportunity to become more fully human. And even in that class I mentioned I had with Angela Davis, there were those opportunities there too. So I guess on the one hand, I'm saying that, a master student in social work, especially if they're in one of these advanced standings, really intensive programs, they really don't have the time or the capacity to, participate in the dialogue that might help them become more fully human and essentially make them a better social worker. And then the other side of things is post-pandemic would be, it's also hard to have those things in those kind of conversations in asynchronous online courses. Not saying it's not possible at all, but it can be very challenging and difficult. And then again, you're eliminating all of the between the classes, after class, having a drink or having coffee or just a conversation with your professor or amongst your peers. You're kind of eliminating all of those opportunities. So what do you think about all that? And how can we counteract that and produce or create opportunities where we can have those dialogues that are so important?
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And I don't want to sound, I'm trying to balance my hope for the future of social work education. And I always try to be in a place where I can think hopefully about that, by also acknowledging that there still remains a lot of concerns about the state of social work education right now. But I think what we're seeing is a shift in the type of student who's going into social work and a shift in what those students expect from a social work education. I think right now the problem in social work education is that there is a huge disconnect between what students going into social work programs want from their education and what social work educational programs are providing to those students. But I think that that's changing rapidly because of the demands of social work students on their educational programs. And I think we're going to see more and more that educational programs start to shift to respond more to what students are wanting out of their programs. I think for a long time, social work education has been kind of stuck in a rut where we've just taught the same thing over and over and over. And like you said, we're largely training people to be clinicians or therapists. And we haven't responded to the shifting dynamic of our student population, who really are wanting to have much broader, expansive conversations about the role of social work in addressing issues of social and racial injustice in society, the role that they could have in those spaces, the role that the broader profession can have in those spaces. They're wanting to have those critical conversations. So I think that's where we're hopefully going to see the shift. Social work education absolutely isn't there yet, but I think they're in a place where they're starting to recognize that the student dynamics have changed and what students want from social work is different. And I see that they're starting to pivot in that way.
Do you ever worry about hurting social workers or students' feelings?
I try to always talk about the profession at large rather than decisions that individual social workers make. And I always also try to ground the things that I say about the need for the profession to move in a more radical abolitionist direction in what our values say we're supposed to be doing. So to me, as long as I'm staying within this idea that a role of social work is to take action against oppression, discrimination, racism, and injustice, I can say that social workers should not be working with the police, because the police are a system that's responsible for oppression, discrimination, inequities. I can say that social workers should not be working in child welfare systems that are forcibly separating children from their families, because that system is responsible for maintaining oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequity in society.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a caller, so I'm going to take that real quick. Simone, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. I just have to say I read an article in the Texas Observer that you wrote about your experience at being let go at the university. And I don't know, I've just never been so inspired. This is why
I lost Simone for a second there. Christian, can you hear?
Can you hear me?
Now I can, yeah.
Okay. I'm in a tiny house in the woods. Sorry.
You're good. I can hear you now.
Okay. Anyway, I went into social work because I became an abolitionist in 2020. I am terrified of what I am reading about Cop City, and have been hearing that they're wanting to build even more of them than just in Atlanta. And I'm wondering if you know anything about that. Yeah, and their connection to Israel. I think I read that they send cops there to train.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a lot there in that question that we could talk about.
Yeah.
You know, First, I'm glad you mentioned Cop City in Atlanta, but as you mentioned, there are cop cities being planned all over the country. I think Atlanta has received the most attention because I think that's where the most active resistance movement has been. But there are plans for similar cop training facilities like that all over the country, and there are movements also happening in those cities to prevent those. But that's where I think that's a space that social work needs to be in that I don't think we're in yet. I think that's one of the challenges that we're up against. Since you brought up that article in the Texas Observer, and when I was removed as dean in December 2022, I think that's part of the challenge that social work faces right now. I think my removal as dean, because of my abolitionist stances, sent a message to other social work programs that aspect of social work, that conversation in social work, wasn't welcome. And I think that put a bit of a chilling effect on social work programs across the country that may otherwise think we should be involved in this movement to stop Cop City. We should be involved in a movement to shut down this new prison or this new juvenile facility that's opening in our community. But look what happened to Alan Dettlaff in Houston when he was trying to do those things. I think that's created a kind of crux in the forward progression of social work. Again, I think that, my hope for the future of social work is at the student level, who are going to continue to push their administrators in their social work programs, the deans and directors in their social work programs, to take bolder, stronger stances that are in line with what our professional values say. We're at a place right now in social work where people are paralyzed with fear, largely related to speaking out about the genocide that's happening in Palestine right now. When you think about what's happening in Palestine, this should be an issue that the entire profession of social work has embraced and are working for a ceasefire, are working for an end to the occupation of Palestine. But what happens is leaders in social work have let fear over their jobs, their titles, their power, their positions, prevent them from taking the actions that they should be taking. So I think we've seen multiple things happen over the past few years. My removal as dean, other social workers who were taking abolitionist stances that have been disciplined by their educational programs, social workers who've lost their jobs over those issues. Now, with what's happened over the past 5 months in terms of silencing related to what's happening in Palestine, I think that social work needs to figure out what it wants to be. It either needs to be a profession that stands true to what it is we say we are, or we're simply a profession that abandons the entire social racial justice mission and trains people to be clinicians and therapists. And I think until we get to that place, until we figure that out, as well as overcome our fears that prevent us from doing those things, we're never going to really progress. So I have a lot of hope that it's going to be the students that push us in a more radical direction. But it's still going to take a lot of work and a lot of struggle.
Thank you so much. It's that's just so inspiring and overwhelming, but also inspiring for why I'm doing what I'm doing, going back to school. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it, and I'm glad you're in school, and I'm glad you're an abolitionist.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Simone. Well, Alan, there's so much that I'm interested in that I want to know more about. Tell us about your removal as the dean.
So I had been dean at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work since 2015. And when I began as dean, I didn't come into the position as an abolitionist. Certainly, that language wasn't even on my radar at that time. But when you think about the timing of when I came into that dean role, I started as dean in fall 2015. Summer of 2016, I remember, was really the time where we started to see a lot of, not necessarily an escalation of police violence against Black Americans, but an escalation of videotaped recordings that we were seeing on the news all the time of police violence, police murders of Black Americans. We saw the country elect a white supremacist to be president. We saw white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, and a focus on, or a really newfound awareness and understanding of how deeply racist the United States is and how deep a problem of racism remained in the United States. And that led me and others in the college to really focus on a racial justice agenda for our college. We had struggled for some time thinking about what we wanted to be, who we wanted to be as a college. And all of the events of 2015 to 2017, 2018 really made us realize that we wanted to make a difference in elevating these conversations about racial justice and social work's role in pursuing racial justice. In 2018, I invited Angela Davis to speak at our college after a couple students advocated for her to come speak at the college. And that was really the first time in 2018 where I heard about prison abolition, when Angela Davis talked about that. And I started applying that to my own thoughts about where I was at that time, which was largely as a child welfare reformer, and how this abolitionist movement fit with policing and prison abolition. So my abolitionist journey really started in around 2018 when I started to read the works of Angela Davis, read the works of other people. As I mentioned, in 2020, we launched the UpEND Movement, which was an abolitionist movement to abolish the child welfare system. And over time, there was a small handful of faculty at my college who were unhappy with that direction that the college was going in and thought that that was going to jeopardize some of their grant money. Several of those faculty received a lot of grant money from the child welfare system, from state child welfare systems. And they were concerned that that racial justice orientation that I was trying to lead in the college were going to affect things like enrollment, grant money, our perception in the community. And they ultimately lobbied with the provost to have me removed from the position because of those things. So I've been out of that position for about a year and a half now.
Sorry, who did you say it was that was lobbying?
Faculty. It was the
social work faculty.
It was social work faculty, and it was four faculty specifically that were full professors in the college that were unhappy with the direction that the school was going.
Yeah, it's just very interesting to me and concerning. I'm a social work professor, but I don't even have a PhD yet, and so I'm lowest man in the hierarchy, no matter how you look at it. And so it's always in the back of my mind, on what I should or can't say. And I want to pivot just a little bit, and I see, Annie, you're trying to call, and I'll get to you in just a second, is Israel-Palestine. And so I know that I think you just had this for your book club a little while ago, but when I met Angela Davis, this book had just come out, and we read it in the class. And it's the first time that I'm not saying it's the first time I'd ever heard of Palestine, but as far as my memory can go, the first time I'd ever heard anybody talk about it in any way, critical way, anything that was asking me to look deeper into it. And I really didn't, to be honest with you. I might have been a little more familiar with what was going on there. I watched a few films and things like that, but I really don't know. And so what's happened the last 6 months or so, however long it's been, I've obviously felt, as somebody who leans toward, abolitionist ways of thinking about things, I obviously believe that I have a responsibility to talk about it. But it's been difficult because I don't have so much knowledge. And so, I feel a responsibility. I've been picking up books, reading about Gaza. And one of the troubling things when I read about it, and this book was like 2018 or something, is that it's like you could just take everything and replace it with what's going on today. It's the exact same context. The only pushback I've ever gotten on the podcast, I've gotten a lot of comments, from folks that say they appreciate it and whatnot, but the only pushback I've gotten is about 5 emails about us talking about Israel-Palestine. And we haven't even really went that deep. We've just kind of beat around the edges of it. But, I have two sides to the question. What is our responsibility as social workers? You mentioned how it's tied into the code of ethics and everything earlier. What is our responsibility to pay attention, but also to talk about and move ourselves further so we understand and see where we can make a difference in this regard? But also, how do we walk that line, and how do we, I also asked about hurting students' feelings. I have Jewish students in my class, and I think that I take a very nuanced and careful approach, but yet I'm also wary of, like ostracizing her, for example. And so what are your thoughts on that? How do we, as social workers, social work educators, how do we walk that line, or should we not walk the line?
Yeah, it's such an important issue for social work to be talking about. And again, one of the things that I think has been reflective of the cowardice of the profession to not be more vocal about what's happening in Palestine right now. And I think something that we as a profession need to figure out a way to push past. I first learned about Palestine from Angela Davis as well. When she came and talked to our school and talked about Palestine. And I read that book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and have since tried to educate myself about Palestine. Obviously, that came to a much bigger national attention last year in October 2022. But I think we're at a place now where we have to recognize that what's happening in Palestine is a genocide. And social work as a profession, because of our commitment to social justice, has to be concerned about that. We can't. First, I think that it's important that anyone who cares about social justice in a global sense. We can't only be concerned about freedom, equality, liberation for all people in the United States. Freedom, equality, liberation, those are global ideas that we need to apply to everyone. So anyone who cares about social justice has to care about Palestine. But then I think we also have to recognize that there are huge domestic policy issues related to this issue when you think about the billions of dollars that are being sent to Israel to support the genocide that they're conducting in Palestine. And if we think about how those billions of dollars can be used here in the United States to address issues of poverty, homelessness, other things, there's both international and domestic aspects to that. But I think that the silence of the social work profession right now, as it relates to speaking out against genocide, is the most shameful thing that I've ever seen in the profession. I recognize that everyone has to make decisions about the extent to which they talk about Palestine because of some restrictions that are placed on them by their employers. But I also think that as social workers, we have a responsibility to speak out against injustice. Again, without telling any specific person what they have to do, because I really do recognize that not everyone can just quit their jobs tomorrow because they want to say something that they've been told they can't say. But I think I would speak particularly more to the people who have power within social work. I always thought when I was dean that As a Mexican American, openly gay, son of an immigrant, this job is not something that I was intended to have. And I was fortunate to have that job. But I also always knew in the back of my mind that I had that job because a white woman chose to give me that job. And at any moment, I could say something or do something that that white woman didn't like, and she could choose to take that job away from me. And in the early years of my career as dean, I let that fear about the position, that power being taken away from me, dictate what I did. In later years, I realized that I had a responsibility as a leader in this profession, or as someone who was perceived to be a leader in this profession, to speak out against injustice wherever that was happening. And at the time, I was really choosing to speak out against police violence, against the racism in policing, the racism in the child welfare system, and to advocate for the profession to take different stances. And I eventually was removed from my position because of that. But I think we all have to really spend time as social workers to think through how we make decisions about what we choose to speak out about. And because I really do think what happens is, as we as social workers, and as particularly people of color, move up career ladders and we come into positions of power, we begin to be afraid of that power being taken away from us. And we start to not speak out about the things that are important to us and the things that we really went into social work in the first place. But when we do that, that's exactly what the white people who are running society and all of the systems that we work in want. They want us to stay silent. They want us to not challenge them and their lack of action. They want us to not challenge these structures like the NASW and like the Council on Social Work Education. They want us to stay quiet. So the fear that they put on us is an intentional act to get us to remain silent. We collectively have to work against that. It's hard for individuals to do that, but I think that that's what we really have to figure out as social workers who want a more radical future for the profession, as social workers who are abolitionists, or social workers who really truly came into the profession and want to work towards social and racial justice. We have to figure out a way to collectively harness our voice and counter the forces that are telling us that we can't speak out.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, like thinking of the idea of, where if you imagine a black man and he's constantly provoked, and then when he gets angry about it, it's like, hey, there's the angry, pointing the finger at him. It's his fault because he's upset about the situation or about the situations. And I think that's even, can be applied to Israel-Palestine provocation. Something happens. Okay, now we're gonna push back, beyond your wildest imagination. Well, I want to circle back to all this into abolition, and we're going to close out I have some ideas how we can close out the podcast talking about it, the episode. But we have Annie calling, and she's been sitting here for a while, so let's bring Annie on.
Hello, everybody. I just realized that my camera was on. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, hi, Annie.
Yep.
Hi. I'm so sorry. She just, as soon as I logged on, she was like, okay, now I need mom.
I can empathize with that.
Oh, Gracie girl, you were so happy like 2 seconds ago. This is anticlimactic. You've been so happy this entire time. There we go. She's really been enjoying the conversation as well.
Great.
But my question is, did you think that was funny? I'm sorry. I won't look at you. I apologize. So my question is, I'm currently working on my bachelor's degree in early childhood development and family studies. Why are you so mad now? Is it because I'm not talking to you? Okay. How about if you turn around, will you be happy now? Okay. How about if you look? There you go. Look, that's yourself. That is yourself. There we go. So again, my degree is going to be in early childhood development and family studies, and I have always been interested in social work. It's never been like my top idea to go into the field, but maybe something that works alongside of social workers, possibly like a child psychologist and things like that. And obviously, I have a lot of experience with having kids of my own and just coming from like a really big family in general. Grace, can you just look at mom for just a minute? Probably because I was. Anyway, so I come from, again, a really big family, and we have a lot of different ethnicities within my family. Oh, hi, Jacob. Just stood right there. Right there. You're fine this entire time. I'll turn my camera off really quick. Just go to my mic. But my question for you guys is, so again, coming from like a really large family, I, again, have a lot of different ethnicities. I grew up in Barrow, Alaska for a couple of years of my life starting off, and then moving down to Fairbanks. And then again, I live in Palmer. And for a few years, like we lived in right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And we actually lived there during the pandemic. And I feel like living in Alaska, I've definitely been sheltered from a lot of the problems that happen outside of Alaska and within the United States. And so moving to like just outside of Nashville, I got a real glimpse of what the rest of the world goes through, especially when it comes to the pandemic. And I never really thought about race particularly because I had so many friends who came from so many different backgrounds, again, coming from a large family. And there were so many times when we were living in Kentucky, Tennessee area, where I would be like out and about with my kids, and everybody would be like, "Oh, are those your kids?" Because my kids are much more fair skinned than I am. And I was like, no one in my entire life has ever asked me that before, unless like I'm with my husband and they kind of like put the pieces together. But if it was just me out with my kids, they were like, "Oh, are those your kids?" And I was like, yes, they're my kids, like not trying to be offended, but like a little bit of offended at the same time. And then of course with the George Floyd murder, and then hearing all in the news about kids of African American descent just being like, I guess like ambushed by police officers and things like that, it really made me open my eyes to, I guess, like a world like I never really knew existed, because I feel like I've been so sheltered living here in Alaska, and I was like, oh, this is like not a problem that we have, but I guess it is a problem that is very common in like the rest of the world. And so as going into child development and maybe one day becoming a childhood psychologist and working with social workers, how can I be prepared for not only when my kids ask me questions in the future about these kind of topics, but how am I supposed to help like other kids when they come to me with these kind of topics as being like a professional?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're already on that process in many ways in terms of learning about and understanding how deep a problem racism is in this country, in the United States, and how deeply racism impacts everything that children and people of color experience throughout their lives. Many of us can think about how harmful racism is on people's mental health, but there's also research that shows that the daily experience of racism in people's lives actually contributes to their actual physical health breaking down over time. It's a phenomenon that people call weathering. If you think of like an old house that's subjected to tornadoes and hurricanes and storms, how it weathers, that's what the human body does when it's exposed to racism day after day after day. So just being aware of how racism overlays every other aspect in society that a child might be facing when they come to you, and acknowledging that and talking about that, I think is important, because a lot of times if I can't say a lot of times, but for many people, that overlay of racism as a larger structural issue might not enter the therapeutic space. So I think it's really important for people like you that are going into that to really have that deep understanding of how big a problem racism is, how it affects children's lives daily, and how that needs to be part of any type of service or therapeutic intervention that you're providing.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things that was a shocker is, again, like, I grew up with, my mom has been a single mom practically my whole life. She married my current stepfather when I was just entering high school. So a very pivotal year for any teenager, preteen. And she was white, or she is white. And so that conversation never came up, and I never had questions about it because I had so many other cousins like who kind of looked like me. I am the only African American in my family, and all of my other cousins were like Filipino, and so they had somewhat darker skin, but again, not the same issues that I had faced. And it never really occurred to me until we lived like outside of Alaska, and I had to come face to face with those problems because nobody ever mentioned it like when I was growing up, and then I was kind of like blindsided by it. And so it's definitely something that not that I want to bring it up to my kids, but if they have questions, like when they get older, my oldest is 5, and then I have a 3-year-old and then a 4-month-old as of tomorrow. And I don't want to shy away from the questions that they're going to have, and just want to approach it with like, oh, like I don't want it to make it a big deal because I don't want them to feel like excluded or left out, kind of like how I felt, but I also want them to be like comfortable in who they are and like in their own skin. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the question.
Thanks, Annie. All right, there's another quick question from Nico in the chat. He said earlier you talked about how police system is part of the problem. Can we still back the blue and still believe in social work values?
What I would say about that is I think that we need to focus on the system of policing. And going back to the earliest origins of policing and prisons in the United States, which were developed largely for the purpose of maintaining the oppression of Black Americans. Policing in America really started out as slave patrols. And after the abolition of slavery, a lot of policing and the expansion of prisons grew out of laws called the Black Codes that criminalized many behaviors that formerly enslaved people did, from things like being unemployed, vagrancy, to being unhoused. Those were things that were all turned into crimes solely if they were committed by formerly enslaved people for the purpose of incarcerating them and then essentially recreating a system of forced free labor through convict leasing programs in the United States. So slavery was abolished. The white people who ran society then lost this free labor source, so went about to create a new means of doing that. Through massive incarceration of the formerly enslaved and then convict leasing programs, which people sometimes call the chain gangs. That's really the origins of policing in prisons in the United States. And that active aspect of oppressing, incarcerating Black Americans has persisted throughout policing to today. And we see that in the disproportionate rates of people who are arrested, incarcerated, given sentences to the death penalty. When we think of policing as an inherently racist institution that is responsible for maintaining oppression in society, I don't think that social work as a profession can support that system. I don't think that social work as a profession should support any system that is actively responsible for maintaining oppression of Black Americans and other people of color in the United States. So I think that social work as a profession should oppose the system of policing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alan, and thanks for the question, Nico. I wonder if we might shift back to more broadly talking about abolition, and I want to share your clip from your UpEND podcast real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Was related to providing. I would go to a home and say, I need to come in and look around. And they would say, okay, and they would open the door. The system will say that's giving consent. It wasn't a forced entry, but they don't know that they can say no, and they're terrified. The system knows that families are terrified. Laws have been proposed related to providing Miranda warnings in various states. The states have vehemently opposed those laws. So that's really telling about the system and how much they know about the weapons that they have at their disposal. And the biggest weapon is that parents don't know what their rights are, and the state is fighting to keep it that way.
Yes.
I would go to a home and say, I need to come in and look around.
All right, tell us about that clip, Alan.
Yeah, so that was a clip about how the child welfare system currently operates and the movement to pass laws around the country that would essentially require child welfare or family policing agents to provide the equivalent of Miranda warnings to parents who are about to undergo a child welfare investigation. I think a lot of people don't realize, well, let me start in a broader sense. I think there's a lot of things that people don't realize generally about how the child welfare system really functions in America. I think a lot of people believe that system is a helpful, benevolent system that works primarily to help and respond to children who are being severely harmed by their parents and need protection from their parents. The reality is that today, 70% of children who are in foster care because of what the state calls neglect, which is largely associated with issues of poverty. So it isn't children who are being harmed that the state's intervening with. Less than 15% of children who are in foster care because of issues of physical or sexual harm. More than 70% of kids in foster care are there because of poverty-related concerns. So what you really have is a system that's taking children away from their parents because they're poor, and then they're giving those children to strangers that we call foster parents, and then paying those strangers money to take care of someone else's children when all those children's parents really need is money. That's what the system is really doing. Another part that people don't realize is how harmful the process of investigations are to families, how terrified people are at the idea of losing their children. And we see this particularly in communities of color, where the child welfare system has such an enormous presence. People like Dorothy Roberts, who has been a longtime child welfare abolitionist, have done studies about the extent of fear that's just rampant in Black communities, particularly in Chicago, which is where she did her studies. Everyone in those communities either has had children taken away or knows someone who's had children taken away from them. So the level of fear that people have about this system is immense. And the system has absolutely no responsibility to tell people what their rights are. So people have the right to refuse to allow a child welfare investigator to come into their home. People have the right to refuse to allow an investigator from interviewing their child. But people don't know that. And so there's a movement right now to try to pass laws that would require child welfare agents to give parents their rights or to tell parents their rights. And states are actively fighting against those laws. I'd say the biggest fight is happening in New York right now, where advocates have been pushing for these Miranda warnings in New York for years now, and the state continually pushes against that, and the state is winning. Legislators in the state are taking the system side and are removing that legislation from advancing in the chamber. And that shows the power of the state. What it shows is that the state doesn't want parents to know what their rights are, because if they did, that would prevent them from doing their jobs. That shows you the harm that's inherent in the system. It shouldn't be difficult to pass a law saying that parents need to know what their rights are. But that's the state of child welfare right now, that the system is actively trying to prevent people from knowing what their rights are.
Yeah, it reminds me of, even the idea of getting pulled over by the police and thinking that you have to consent to a search, or even if you know that you don't have to consent, but thinking that you're going to be thought of as guilty if you push back at all versus, knowing, knowing your rights and standing up for yourself.
That's how these carceral harmful systems operate. They operate on the fear of the power of what you know about the power they have. With policing, it's the fear that you can be arrested. With the child welfare system, it's the fear that you can take their children away. So, I said parents have the right to refuse to let a child welfare investigator in their home, but there's nothing then that prevents the child welfare system from using that against parents. That's what the problem is. Then the system can say the parent is uncooperative, they must be hiding something. And all of that information can then be used as justification to take someone's child away from them. That's how these systems operate. And that shows the huge power imbalance inherent in these systems too.
Yeah, so how do you think we should support those parents? You say, sometimes they just need some more money or they need support versus, maybe versus the threat of having their children removed or other consequences. How can we help them?
We can give them money. That's really the simple answer. That sounds simple, but like I said, right now in Texas, I can use Texas as an example. We pay foster parents an average of about $1,000 a month to take care of someone else's child. What if we just gave that $1,000 a month to the child's parent who is struggling to meet their children's needs? That would prevent the need for child welfare involvement in a lot of cases. And I don't want to make it sound like money is the solution to everything, because there's my work and a lot of abolitionist work really does focus on capitalism as a broader problem of that. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm just advocating for a bigger welfare state. But in the short term, when we know that just a lack of this thing called money is the problem that leads a lot of children to being separated from their parents and going into foster care, we can advocate for passing laws like universal basic income, child allowances, free and accessible childcare, free and accessible health care for everyone. Laws like that would significantly reduce the number of children right now who are being forcibly taken away from their parents by the state, solely due to poverty reasons.
Yeah, well, what do you think about some of the more serious cases, let's say like sexual abuse or, even if there's like rampant drug dealing or prostitution going on in the household? How do you think that we should approach those situations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, it's hard to think about those cases like what we would do in a case today or tomorrow where that's happening, because we tend to think about, or people who haven't really studied abolition sometimes think that this movement is solely about ending this system, ending policing, ending the child welfare system, when abolition is really much more about building new structures, new ways of approaching societal problems. And if we were to be able to get to a place where there was a universal basic income, where there was free and accessible childcare, healthcare, housing, substance use treatment for everyone who wanted and needed that, we wouldn't have many of the social conditions that lead children to becoming involved in this system is the first place. But even when we create that world, it's important to acknowledge there still will be harm that occurs. When we think about what should happen when children are harmed, I think first we need to start by understanding what shouldn't happen. When a child is harmed, we shouldn't respond in ways that cause further harm. And that's what we know family separation does right now. Family separation, forcibly taking children away from their parents, causes children lifelong and significant trauma, regardless of how long that separation lasts. So we know that causes harm. And we can look at just a recent example. If you look at the zero tolerance policy of 2018 under the Trump administration, where children were being forcibly separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. That was a national news story. People across the country were outraged about those separations. There were groups of psychologists and psychiatrists and pediatricians who were calling on the government to end that zero tolerance policy and saying that family separation was tantamount to torture. If family separation was tantamount to torture when it was happening at the U.S.-Mexico border, it's tantamount to torture every day when those separations are conducted by child welfare agents. So first we have to start by recognizing that we shouldn't be responding to harm in ways that cause more harm. What should we do? I think that best way that I've been able to think about answering that is first thinking about existing in a society where families have access to resources that they need to access help when they're in need of help. And then imagine in that society, think about your own family, think about your own community of people who love and care about each other, and imagine that a child were harmed in that family. What would you want to happen? Would you want to get together as a family and as a community and figure out what should happen to protect that child from further harm? Or would you want the government to take that child away from you and to figure out how to protect that child? I think that most people would choose that first option. They would want to get together as a community and figure out how to protect this child. And that's the kind of responses that I think we need to be moving towards. Trusting families and communities to prevent the children in their families from being harmed and knowing that they have the resources to do so.
Yeah, and I think a good point of that too is I've had some experience as a youth advocate working with children in foster care a long time ago. And one of the biggest things that astounded me was that oftentimes they'd take these kids out of their home, but then they'd put them in a place that wasn't very nice. You know, it was a group home where there was strict rules and bad things going on, or a treatment center owned by Universal Health Services, or detention, or sometimes the foster parents. Like, I have one example. I had two Latino boys from a house, which there weren't terrible things going on, but they were selling drugs and some gang involvement. But they were placed with this old white family, and they were nice folks for the most part, but they were like extremely LDS religious, and they had nothing in common with those boys, and they made them put on church clothes and go to Sunday every week, and those kids just, there was no connection there at all. And I'm thinking, well, why would you take them out of there and put them here? I mean, again, that's not the worst. I could think of worse places you could put them than that house, but it just doesn't make sense. And so I think child welfare doesn't make sense in a lot of ways, but it really doesn't make sense if we're not taking care of those children and putting them somewhere that we can guarantee is a better place. And I think all of us that have been in the field of, have heard stories or been involved in something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it, and I'm sure the case, that particular case was complex in ways, but think about the reasons that you talked about why those kids were separated from their family because of drug issues and gang activity. Those are larger structural societal problems that we can and should address as a society. Taking those children away from their parents doesn't do anything to solve problems of drug use and gang activity. All it does is harm those children further. But then, like you said, I mean, the example that you gave of putting those children in this home where they were kind of forced into a different religious environment, different cultural environment, that's harmful. But we also know that rates of physical and sexual abuse in foster care are 2 to 3 times higher than rates of physical and sexual abuse in the general public. So one, the system is causing harm just by the act of forcibly separating children from their families. But two, the system is causing harm by putting children in environments where they're likely to experience even more harm than they were experiencing prior. So nothing about what the system is doing right now is helpful for children or responding to their welfare.
Yeah, and I think a good place for anybody that's interested in this realm to dig deeper, look into Paris Hilton in Utah. That's where I was at the time. I didn't work with Paris Hilton, but that's how they treated a rich white girl. So I want you to imagine how they treat the Alaskan Natives, the Native American kids that they send from South Dakota and Montana, the black kids that they send from back east, and they put them in an environment, like I can speak of one environment owned by Universal Health Services in Utah. But essentially what they do is they take all these kids from around the country, most of them, almost all of them, but not exclusive, but almost all non-white kids, and they bring them to Utah, which is an extremely homogenous white, and not completely again, but mostly white environment. And what the expectations for those kids is to become a middle-class white kid. That's what they're supposed to act like. And it's not in their realm of understanding, of consciousness, and it just doesn't work. And then, you got kids in there that are in there for like something like aggravated assault, and they're being punished for cursing or something like that. You know what I mean? And it's just the results that the expectations they have on those kids are unattainable. And like you said, I believe that it's harmful to them.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us back to where we started. The entire social work profession was built on the idea of making children more like middle-class white children. That's the origins of this profession, and that's what we're still doing 150, 170 years later. And that's what we have to start to confront.
Right. We're unaware of ourselves. I have Charlotte on here who has a really good some practical questions about that video you showed earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You there, Charlotte?
Yes. Can you see me?
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, so that's fine then. I thought my camera was on as well, but okay. So my so my question is well, first of all, sorry, my name is Charlotte Huckabee. I'm currently the Director of Elder Services. I have a lot of background in working as a court clerk deputy dealing with juvenile cases. That was what I said in the courtroom. I grew up with in Chandler, Oklahoma. My best friend was raised in the foster system, and so I'm very familiar with it. My family have been guardianships and foster parents and things to grandkids and that type of thing. But my question for you is, where could parents learn more about their rights of child welfare entering their home?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of places that are trying to really disseminate that information and get more information out about what parents' rights are. I would say the most active organizations doing that work, or the most active organization doing that work, is called JMAC for Families. They're based out of New York. They're led by a brilliant activist, Joyce McMillan, who's been working in this field for years. And she, along with some other organizations in New York, are really actively trying to pass laws to ensure that parents are provided with their rights. Those are state laws that are being done in New York, but those kind of laws are being replicated all over the country. So I would recommend looking at her website, which is jmacforfamilies.org, and then also the UpEND Movement, which shares a lot of similar information, upendmovement.org.
Okay, thank you so much. One other question I have is, what would you suggest saying to a parent who is facing child welfare come into their home? And real quick, before you answer, I wanted to say why I'm asking this question. I, as a director here of Elder Services, have many employees. I have had a couple of young single mothers raising children as employees that have faced this very situation, that have stressed to the max. Them coming to their home, waiting on that knock on their door, waiting on that phone call for weeks, and it never happening. So they had an appointment. This was supposed to happen. They have to leave work, get home, rush home for them to never show up. But what would you suggest saying to a parent who is facing this type of situation?
You know, it's a difficult question to be able to give parents advice about that, because of, like we've talked about, how much power this system has to take children away. I think the best thing that I could say to parents is to know what your rights are, to educate yourself about those rights. And if you're faced with a situation where you're involved in a child welfare investigation like this, look for resources in your community, particularly resources that may provide legal assistance in these cases, because that's really what's needed to counter the harm and the power that this system wields.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you. Thank you for bringing me on, Professor, as well.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we're getting to the end of time here, and there's a couple questions in the chat, and if anybody has any last-minute things that they want to talk about or ask or call in, then now would be the time. But there's a couple of questions in the chat here. So Haley says, I'm a mixed person and a person with family members across different cultures. I'm a racist. I can see instances where I act in ways that uphold white supremacy and don't always stand up for my belief that I also call my belief, etc. To be able to look at myself critically is difficult, and I feel most people don't want to look at themselves like that or do the work. I think not only is social work not abolitionist, I would argue education isn't as well. How is the best way to reach people if not through these avenues?
Mm-hmm. I think that's where that's where students need to begin to recognize how much power that they have. Social work education is only going to change when students demand that it change, when students organize and demand that their curriculum is different, that their curriculum start to address these issues, that their professors start to address these issues in their classrooms. I can tell you, as a former dean, as someone who was responsible for a large school of social work, students are the most powerful group of people in those organizations. Students are the consumers. And students, when students organize and demand change, that's what prompts administrators, faculty, other leaders in the school to respond to those changes. So I would encourage students to organize and demand changes. And I mean really, really organizing. Writing petitions, getting signatures on petitions, walking out of classes, doing demonstrations. Look at the history of organizing movements and what's successful and replicate those things. When students start to demand something different, that's when the education that students get will change.
Right on. And then there's a question, or there's a comment from Jensen that I wanted to read. I think it was important. She says, I just wanted to thank you for the comment about social work. Either needs to be a profession that stands true to its purpose, or social work that needs to be something that abandons social and racial justice and trains people to be professionals and clinicians. As an Indigenous woman, as an Alaskan Native individual, I feel torn to obtain my degree to secure my seat at the table while holding true to my roots and my Indigenous values. You're an inspiration, and I appreciate your presence today. Thank you, Jensen.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's a struggle that many people who are in social work are facing right now, because of there is a disconnect in many cases between the values that we believe in, that we went into the social work profession because of, and what we're seeing the profession do, the way that the system practices today. But that's where I think the organizing, again, to bring it back to that, comes from. The organizing that we as social workers, whether we're students or whether we're practitioners, need to do to bring about. We are the people who can bring about a different future for the profession, not our professional organizations, not the deans and directors who run the programs. It's we, the people who want to see something better, want to see a different future for social work. We're the ones who need to organize and demand it to bring about that change.
Thank you. And then Roberta asks, she wants to know about ICWA. For those of you who aren't familiar, Indian Child Welfare Act. It was created basically because we were removing children from indigenous homes and placing them outside of their culture in other homes. So do you have any information or anything you want to share about ICWA and the role of tribal courts?
I'm not an expert in ICWA, so I can't really speak to how the role of tribal courts in child welfare proceedings. I think that ICWA was an important policy necessary to protect both tribal sovereignty and to protect the rights of tribes to control what happens to the children who are part of their tribes. I think that ultimately we need to be working towards a society where we don't have children who are at risk of being forcibly separated from their parents. When we work towards addressing the structural conditions that bring children to the attention of the system, then we can work towards a system where we don't need something like ICWA to prevent children from being taken away from their parents.
I appreciate that answer. And then we'll take one more question from the audience. Nico says, Alan, as a person who was once in a position to do the right thing and making the right decision, looking back on the outcome of being removed, what advice do you have for minorities that are in positions of power? How do we navigate the system? How do we do the right thing without worrying about being labeled as the difficult person?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And again, I want to be sure I always hesitate to give people advice when it comes to what they should do in their careers, because I know that a lot of value calculations need to be made from that, and not everyone can do things so that they can just walk away from their jobs tomorrow. But I do think that people and people of color, and particularly who are in leadership positions, need to think through themselves what they're going to stand up for and what their values are as it relates to standing up and being authentic and speaking with integrity, because I do think we have a responsibility to push back on some of the aspects of these systems that we're in that continue to maintain our oppression. But it really is, we have to make individual decisions about that, but thinking through how the importance of our authenticity, our integrity, and the need for people to speak up, I think, needs to be paramount in those decisions.
Thanks for the question, Nico. All right, I have one last question for you, Alan, to wrap things up. So if Angela Davis were here, she would say, she often reflects that she gets asked the question, well, what are we going to do? What are you just going to let everybody out of prison? What are you going to do with all of them? And it's a valid question, because there are I've known a lot of mean and nasty people in this world. I'm not saying they're always going to be that way, but it does beg the question, what would we do? And Angela Davis would respond something to the lines of, well, if we never imagine anything different, if we can't ever imagine a life or a world without these systems in place, then we'll for sure never get there. So my last question to you, Alan, is, how do you imagine the future of social work, the future, wherever you want to take it, the future of abolition? How do you imagine it?
Mm-hmm. I think, I was just rereading Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete this last week because of a writing project that I'm working on. And I mean, there's a whole chapter devoted to Angela Davis talking about what we can and what we can't imagine. And we often do get stuck in what we can imagine to be the future because of what we've been socialized to believe is essential in our society. And Angela Davis in that book talks about how people during the era of chattel slavery never thought that there would be a society without slavery. People who grew up during the era of Jim Crow never thought that we would be in a society where there were civil rights laws, where lynchings were ended, where there were laws to move towards equality. And I think we have to be in that space today. We're conditioned to think that we live in a society where the police, prisons, child welfare systems are indispensable, rather than thinking about what we can do to create a society where those systems are obsolete. So the future for social work is to imagine ourselves outside of those systems, to imagine what type of society we need to create so that prisons, policing, family separations would never be brought into existence, because the idea of those things, systems that lock people in cages, systems that forcibly take children away from their parents, those ideas would never be brought into existence, and they wouldn't be needed to be brought into existence because people have everything that they need to live and thrive in their homes and communities. That's the work that social work should be working towards, or that's the future that social work should be working towards. So we have to start imagining what that society should look like, what a society looks like that doesn't have prisons, policing, and child welfare. And then that's the work that social work should be doing. Not working to maintain those systems, but working to build a society where those systems are no longer needed.
It's a wonderful answer. I really appreciate your time, Alan. And I think you've encouraged folks to, use their imagination, to look critically, look within, look outwards. Don't take things for granted. Challenge the status quo.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to remark real quick, that book that you mentioned, Our Prisons Obsolete, is just a little sliver of a book, but it's one of the best books you'll ever read. So if you're looking for a dive into the area, want to know more, want something to tug at your imagination, challenge you to look differently and look at things differently, that's a great place to start. Angela Davis, Our Prisons Obsolete. And there's also a free documentary on YouTube that covers that a little bit. It's called The Black Power Mixtape. It's now for free on YouTube, so just look that up. And if you're in my class, you would have already watched it last week. So,
Great.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Alan. It's been a great conversation. It was a privilege and an honor to speak with you. I feel like we could have talked about abolition for hours and hours. There's so much that I want to talk about, to unfold. And so I just really want to thank you for giving us your time, your wisdom, your expertise, sharing your experience, your stories. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to share any last words.
I appreciate it as well, and absolutely I appreciate you lifting up Angela Davis' book, Our Prisons Obsolete. If you're interested in learning more about the child welfare abolition movement specifically, we have a lot of great resources at UpEndMovement.org. And then I have a book that came out last year called Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System, The Case for Abolition, that tries to lay out a case for abolition. My inspiration for that book, not that it achieved it in any way, but my inspiration for that book was always to be just a small book that just hit all the right points, just like Our Prisons Obsolete, but to make the case for child welfare abolition. So if you're interested in learning more about that, there's that resource as well.
I will be checking it out for sure. Thanks
Awesome.
for sharing.
Thank you.
All right, Alan, we'll take care, and I'm sure that we'll speak again. It's a small movement right now, but hopefully we're growing. The abolitionist, critical social work, revolutionary social work, many different names that it might go by. But I'm sure we'll speak again. I wish you the best. Take care, and I'll get this uploaded maybe in the next week or so.
Awesome. Thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation to be here. And thanks to everyone who jumped on with questions.
This episode was recorded live on March 26th, 2024. This episode featured Dr. Alan Dettlaff. It was hosted by Christian Ace Stettler. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks Department of Social Work. This has been a Conscious Party production. You've been listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. Your story, my story, our story. All right, everyone. Until next time, keep being revolutionary. Peace.